1980s New York, before the cleanup. Before gentrification sanitized every corner. Those of us who lived through it remember a different New York. Grittier, rawer, more dangerous, more alive. This is the story of 10 moments that define 1980s New York. The decade that changed everything. The city will never get back. The 80s weren't perfect. Far from it. Crime was high. The subways were covered in graffiti. Times Square was dangerous after dark. But something about that chaos made New York feel electric in ways the polished modern city never will. This was the decade that gave birth to hip-hop, when punk rock still mattered, when Broadway was at its absolute peak, when you could still afford to be an artist and actually live in Manhattan. By the time the 90s arrived, everything had changed. The city got safer, but the 80s? That was New York's last wild decade. And those of us who remember it carry those moments with us. Before Times Square became a sanitized tourist trap, Broadway was actually magical. The early 80s brought Cats, Les Mis, Phantom of the Opera, Dreamgirls. These weren't just shows. They were cultural events that defined an era. We remember getting dressed up for the theater. Bernadette Peters was lighting up stages. Patti LuPone became a legend. After the show, you'd head to Sardi's on West 44th, the legendary Broadway bar where actors and directors gathered after performances. Real conversations. No phones. Just the thrill of being in the heart of theater capital of the world. Today, Broadway still exists, but it's expensive. The magic we remember? That died with the 80s. Studio 54 didn't start in the 80s. It ended there. December 1980. Federal agents arrested owners Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager for tax evasion. The most famous nightclub in the world shut its doors. For those of us old enough to remember, that night marked the end of something. The death of disco. Studio 54 was never just a club. It was where celebrities mixed with nobodies under flashing lights. Where anything could happen, and usually did. When it closed, an era died with it. We still walk past that building on West 54th. It's a theater again now. But every time we see it, we remember what it used to be. And what the city lost when it disappeared. While Manhattan partied at Studio 54, something revolutionary was happening in the Bronx. Hip-hop. Born in rec rooms and community centers and block parties. DJs like Grandmaster Flash spinning records. MCs grabbing microphones and creating a new form of poetry. The early 80s brought Run DMC, LL Cool J, and the Beastie Boys. Rap music went from Bronx basements to mainstream radio, from underground movement to cultural force. We remember when hip-hop was still dangerous. When our parents told us it was just noise that would disappear. They were wrong. Hip-hop didn't disappear. It took over the world. And it all started here, in the Bronx, in the 80s. In a New York that was raw enough and real enough to create something completely new. CBGB on the Bowery, the legendary punk club that defined downtown music for decades. By the 80s, punk was evolving. The Ramones were still playing. The club became a birthplace for bands that would change music forever. We remember standing in that grimy, beer-soaked space. The bathroom covered in graffiti and band stickers. The stage barely elevated from the floor. Sound so loud your ears rang for days. You didn't go to CBGB for comfort. You went for the music. For the energy. The club survived into the 2000s. But its soul died with the 80s. By the time it finally closed in 2006, it had become a tourist attraction. A relic of something we'd already lost. The Bowery today is unrecognizable. Luxury condos where CBGB used to stand. Another piece of the city's character erased for profit. But there's more. Technically, the blackout happened in '77, but its shadow loomed over the entire 80s. July 13th, 1977. The power went out across the city, and chaos erupted. Looting, arson, over 1,500 stores destroyed. Entire neighborhoods burned. Those of us who lived through it or grew up hearing the stories carried that night into the 80s. It became a symbol of how dangerous New York could be, how quickly order could collapse. The city spent the 80s recovering from that night. building back, trying to prove we weren't the disaster zone the rest of the country thought we were. Every time the lights flickered, we remembered. Every time summer heat hit and the grid struggled, we wondered if it would happen again. The blackout shaped how we saw our city for an entire decade. A reminder that New York's chaos was always just beneath the surface. Before Soho became luxury boutiques and high-end shopping, it was something completely different. Industrial buildings, abandoned warehouses, massive lofts that struggling artists transformed into living studios because they couldn't afford anywhere else. The early 80s saw Soho explode as an art scene, galleries popping up in converted factories, painters, sculptors, and experimental designers making names for themselves in spaces that cost almost nothing. We remember when Soho felt dangerous at night, when the cobblestone streets were empty, except for artists hauling canvases, when you could still afford to live there if you were willing to deal with no heat and sketchy plumbing. By the late 80s, it was already changing. Rent was rising. The artists were being pushed out. Luxury was moving in. Today, Soho is unrecognizable. High-end brands, tourist crowds, the artists who made Soho cool. They can't afford to live there anymore. That transformation started in the 80s, and we watched it happen. The 80s brought something dark to New York. Drug epidemic. It started in the early part of the decade and exploded by mid-80s. Entire neighborhoods were devastated. The South Bronx, Harlem, parts of Brooklyn. The drugs tore through communities like wildfire. We remember when you didn't walk through certain blocks after dark, when whole streets became open-air drug markets, when violence spiked and the city felt like it was losing control. The drug epidemic defined the darker side of 80s New York. While Manhattan celebrated Broadway, other neighborhoods were fighting for survival. It wasn't until the 90s that the city finally got it under control. But the damage was done. Families destroyed, communities scarred, a generation lost. The 80s weren't just bright lights and music. For many New Yorkers, they were the hardest decade we'd ever lived through. But it gets darker. Greenwich Village in the 80s, the heart of LGBTQ culture, and ground zero for a crisis that killed thousands. AIDS appeared in the early 80s. At first, nobody understood it. Then it started spreading, and the deaths began. The village lost an entire generation. Artists, writers, musicians, activists, people who made the neighborhood what it was. We remember the fear, the confusion, the anger at a government that ignored the crisis for years. The funerals that became constant. ACT UP formed in 1987. Activists fighting back, demanding research, demanding treatment, demanding that people pay attention to the deaths happening every single day. The village today still carries the scars. Murals remembering those we lost. The AIDS Memorial in St. Vincent's Triangle Park. The stories passed down about friends and lovers and neighbors who never made it out of the 80s. That decade took so much from the LGBTQ community, and those of us who lived through it will never forget. Tower Records on Broadway and 4th Street. For anyone who loved music in the 80s, it was sacred ground. 3 floors of vinyl, cassettes, and later CDs. You could spend hours just browsing, discovering new artists, listening to albums on the in-store headphones, talking to the staff who actually knew music. Rolling Stone called it the best record store in the world. And it was. You went there not just to buy music, but to be around other people who cared about music the way you did. It closed in 2006. The building is still there, but it's empty. A shell of what it used to be. Music today is instant, streaming, invisible. But we remember when finding music was an experience. When Tower Records felt like a community. When music mattered in a way that algorithms can never replicate. The subways in the 80s were rolling art galleries. Every train covered in graffiti. Bright colors, wild styles. Tags and murals that turned the system into something uniquely New York. We remember riding trains that were completely painted, inside and out. Artists risking arrest to leave their mark on the city. The MTA hated it, called it vandalism, spent millions trying to stop it. By the late 80s, they were winning. Clean trains started appearing. The graffiti era was ending. Today, the subways are clean, functional, boring. You can actually see through the windows. But those of us who rode the painted trains remember what they represented. A city that was messy and dangerous and creative and alive in ways the sanitized modern version will never be. The graffiti wasn't just vandalism. It was the city expressing itself. And when they scrubbed it away, they erased part of what made New York actually New York. The 80s weren't perfect. They were dangerous, dirty, hard. People died. Neighborhoods suffered. But there was something about that chaos that made New York feel alive in ways it doesn't anymore. We lived through it. We remember the danger and the art and the music and the loss. We remember when the city felt unpredictable, when anything could happen, when New York was raw and real and ours. Today, the city is safer, cleaner, more convenient. For many people, it's better. When they scrubbed away the graffiti and closed the clubs and pushed out the artists, they made New York polished, but they stripped away its soul. 10 moments that define 1980s New York, the last decade before everything changed. Broadway's golden age, Studio 54's death, hip-hop's birth, CBGB's evolution, the blackout shadow, Soho's transformation, the drug epidemic, the AIDS crisis, Tower Record's cathedral, the graffiti-covered subways. These moments made the city what it was, shaped the generation that lived through them, created a New York that doesn't exist anymore. So next time someone tells you the 80s were better, remember this. They weren't easier. They weren't safer. They weren't cleaner. But they were real, and they were ours. The city today has its own moments being created right now, its own stories being written. But the 80s? That was New York's last wild decade. And those of us who lived through it will never forget. Want to wear the spirit of the 80s New York? Check out my designs inspired by the decade that defined the city. Link in the comments. If this brought back memories, hit like and subscribe for more forgotten New York history. And if you thought the 80s defined New York, wait until you hear the next story.